Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Leah Schlechter, and I work at Teton County Library in Jackson, Wyoming. And thank you for coming to the second night of Mountain Story 2022. And we've had to shift things around. This would have been maybe the third event. But also welcome to Doug Peacock's publication day for his book, Was It Worth It? And I'm going to introduce Doug, and then Doug will do a reading and talk, and then followed by a Q&A. If there are any questions, you can drop it in the chat and or raise your hand and I can call on you, but we'll get started. Doug Peacock is an American naturalist, outdoorsman, and author. He is best known for his book, Grizzly Years, In Search of the American Wilderness, a memoir of his experiences in the 1970s and 1980s, much of which he spent alone in the wilderness of the Western US observing grizzly bears. He co-founded Save the Yellowstone Grizzly, Wildlife Damage Review, Vital Ground, and Round River Conservation Studies. He serves as a chairman of the board of directors for Round River, which works with Indigenous people and governments in Namibia, Botswana, North, South, and Central America to develop conservation strategies protecting and enhancing intact ecosystems. Doug lives in Emigrant, Montana, and spends considerable time in the Sonoran Desert, Southeast Utah, and with grizzlies of Glacier and Yellowstone National Parks. And he is joining us from where are you tonight, Doug? Somewhere in Arizona?
Yeah, I'm about 40 miles north of the Mexican border, but my passport expired, so I can't sneak down there this time. But it's this little town is Ajo, Arizona, and I have the kind of affection for Ajo that Ed Abbey once had for Moab, Utah. You know, I don't envy, you know, the polluted Phelps Dodge abandoned mining town or anything about it, but it's surrounded by the most beautiful desert country, and I've always come for that. And you know, I've been coming here, it dates me, but 50 years now. So we're about 40 miles north of the wall. The most striking thing about Trump's wall is it's all there. It's all an absolute barrier to all wildlife migrations. Anything that can't fly or crawl isn't going to make it.
All right, take it away, Doug.
Let's see. The program tonight, I thought you'd probably get sick of hearing me drone on. So we're going to show a short film that Ben Moon made. It's a beautiful film, and it's kind of about, it's like the book. It's like my life and looking back on it. And we'll do that in the middle, but it's got some nice grizzly footage, and I just thought that'd be appropriate. So I'll read, and you know, mostly I'd like to hear from you guys. Anytime you've got a question or a comment, you can just jump right in. You know, it won't bother me a bit. But I thought that here's the cover of the book. Let's see if I can get it in there or not. That's a polar bear spear that I carried. Doug Tompkins took this picture up in the high Canadian Arctic. That's the polar bear spear that I carried on a beluga whale expedition where everybody was nervous about polar bears. I took the spear, I had the spear made because I refused to carry what was required by law, which is a high-powered firearm. You know, I just didn't think it was quite ethical to invade the last country of the last polar bears. And if things just didn't go just so according to our agenda, blow the bear away, you know? And so I carried the spear, which I didn't have to use. But had I tried to use it, I would lose at least 99 out of 100 times. So, you know, it's better for all of it. I came back with the spear intact. I wrote this book just as I finished this book. The pandemic was blossoming. And I finished it down not far from here, just sitting out in the desert. And, I hit the road with, and there it came. And it's a long time later, and years went by, and they're just publishing the sucker today. But I thought I would just read. I did an introduction. It's I don't even know what I called it. Preface, I guess. But anyway, let me just read this. This preface is entitled "Winter Count," and I may have to put in these ugly bad glasses because the sun is setting here, and my old eyes aren't what they used to be. Winter count. I log my life by winter counts in the fashion of the Plains tribes who painted significant events on the inner sides of a bison hide. This might be a battle, a treaty, an encounter with a dangerous creature, finding a spirit animal, or possibly a winter so cold that the cottonwood trees blew apart. Though the indigenous peoples tended to mark each year, not every year of my life was worthy of a winter count. Sometimes counts could come bundled in decades with only the rivulets of spring runoff and the emergence of bears to mark the in-between times. So it was with me. I started a new count in 1968. There was my life before the war that prepared me for a life in the wilderness, a good life, full of swamps, rivers, woods, deserts, and mountains. From 1965 to 1968, I worked as a special forces medic who attended too much collateral damage. That cowardly phrase they apply to the pile of small, dismembered bodies after a botched air attack. After March 1968, I applied the anger I had built to the defense of wild things, dimly realizing that the fate of the earth and their inhabitants depended on uncompromising protection of the wilderness homeland and wild creatures. My war experience, I just hit a button by mistake here. I am the least graceful human example I know for working on high-tech things. I spent all day, being cross-trained. And listen, Leah, can you see me?
Yes, I can see and hear you.
And you can hear me. Okay, I think we're okay now. My war experiences, good and bad, prepared me for the fight. It was a gift. I learned to love grizzly bears. I also fell in love with the Lower Sonoran Desert, a romance started in the early 60s, but broken by the separations of the war. Space and endless clean vistas, unbroken by the forest I so cherished up north. By late 1968, I had two opposing mistresses, grizzly bears in the Northern Rockies and the desert Southwest. When the bears hibernated, I hightailed it south. It's winter now, and I sit in a sun-filled desert wash. A few ground flowers are blooming, and the stalks of brittlebush show a rare yellow blossom. I sit several days' walk from where Ed Abbey is buried. This Lower Sonoran Desert country is still considered a wilderness, and I miss my buddies with whom I shared many of these adventures. Ed Abbey, Peter Matheson, Doug Tompkins, and Jim Harrison. I've always dreaded the loss of wild country, so much that I cared not to live without it. Now another threat. The beast of our time, the warming planet, has edged into the sky, and every creature on Earth bigger than a field vole is at risk of decimation or extinction. And there it is, back to Ed Abbey's ancient quandary, what to do. Duty textured in the joy of living fully and loving the earth. Except for a pledge to fight to the literal end, I never quite solved this problem. Everybody's mortality is in the lens now, and it's not necessarily a telephoto shot. So I've spliced together some stories to fill the spaces between the infrequent books I've written. And I'll just tell us for a few minutes. You know, there's a bunch of stories that have a chapter which I'll share with you that introduces it and sort of answers and closes it. And in between, I picked stories of trips that had some significant biological, historic, or other facts that really needed to be recorded somewhere, and I'd never published them. You know, for instance, the first story that I'm going to mostly read, I stumbled across in Yellowstone, in the backcountry of Yellowstone, up Pelican Valley. I found Edwin Howell's 1894 poaching camp. And he, of course, was, Yellowstone's most famous outlaw. The superintendent at the time said, that was the most important arrest they ever made. And in short, he had tobogganed out of Cook City to go down in a blizzard down into Astringent Creek, Pelican Valley in Yellowstone. And and Yellowstone at the time really only had, the one. It wasn't called a ranger or anything, but one person kind of looking out for the whole damn park. And this guy crossed Howell's sledge marks around Soda Butte and followed him in a blizzard all the way down to Stringent Creek, which I've done several times during the summertime and considered it a challenge. And these guys did it in the wintertime. When they got down there, they saw Howell, and nearby were 4 buffalo hides and heads hung up in lodgepole pine trees, high enough that the grizzly bears and the coyotes couldn't get to them. At that time, which is in the 70s, there weren't any wolves in Yellowstone Park. Anyway, this fine guide, as he was called by the Park Service, went out with a .30 caliber pistol and got the drop on Howell, who was preoccupied with skinning out a bison carcass. And they found Howell because they heard a shot and they glassed out in the meadow. And they were able to sneak up on this guy, and even though he had a dog with him, and get the drop on him. And the important thing that grew out of this was that, what was Grinnell's publication? It was like an early Field and Stream, like the Forest Journal or something like that. But the editor of they had a correspondent in the field near Yellowstone that got a hold of the story. And of course, his boss was George Bird Grinnell, a really wonderful, just such a talented man and a conservationist. Eventually, he'd been in the West for 20 years then, from 1874 until he got busted, and he just kind of disappeared. So, at least 20 years that we know of. And at that time, there's no penalties. All they could do with Howell is to confiscate the meat and take him to the boundary of Yellowstone Park and let him go. So, he walked free. And I stumbled across his camp. Well, I was up Stringent Creek on snowshoes in the spring in April, and and I was filming grizzlies at that time, and I'd spotted a mother grizzly with her 2 yearling cubs, and I filmed her a little bit and went around her, and when I came back, she was digging in the same place. So Stringent Creek back then was a defile of meadows and lodgepole forests. It's subsequently been altered by wildfires, and it's really hard to find things. But I took a shortcut to avoid bothering the bears, and and there was clear spots on the ground next to trees and sunny areas. And I started to see axe hewing lodgepole stumps, first one or two, and then a whole bunch of them. And in the trees were the remains of hanging logs, for carcasses. And there's some other stuff there, makeshift tables or chairs, or I don't know what they were. And there was a bunch of, litter on the ground. There were some old tin cans, and there was glass, bottles mostly. And I knew, and I collected a bunch of the bottle tops. And I had to do subsequent research on this, but there were crown tops, which was an invention of the top of a bottle that dates back to 1892. And, and it dawned on me, hell, this is, a whiskey bottle that belonged to the poacher Howell. And, sorry, I lost my concentration. That date placed him right in there. And that, a neighbor of mine, John Tolofano, wrote a beautiful biography on George Bernard Grinnell, and he filled me in and, gave me all the information. But, Grinnell, who was back in the East, got a hold of the information and just wrote scathing articles, blaming Congress especially for not having any penalties on the book for Yellowstone Park or poaching in national parks or any other kind of defense. And, subsequently, and I just mean 3 or 4 days later, Congress passed the Lacey Act, which prohibited all kinds of, poaching and spoliation, of any national park feature, tree, animal, or anything else, and it's still in the books today. And that was a tremendous. So that was the end of the, the Yellowstone bison poaching. But, by the time they finally did, those were the last bison of the 60 million we used to have here in the, on the high plains and other places in the West. And the park did a census of sorts back in 1902. They could only find 23 or 24 wild bison right there, same place in Pelican Valley. And those were thought to be the last free-ranging bison on Earth of the 60 million that once ranged the high plains. I'll read a little bit from that in a minute. Anyway, I just wanted to point that out because I won't have time to. Pamela,
Would you like me to show the slideshow with some of the photos?
no, I'm sad. It's just that I keep hitting the book on the computer, and Lord knows where I am now. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Pam, this is her computer. I had to borrow it because. I'm just going to read a short piece of this because it takes place in Yellowstone, and that is the backyard to all of us. Anyway, I didn't talk much in this book about, I made 7, for me, historic walks in the country west of here. It's the longest unroaded wilderness I know of in the lower 48, and I'd walk 160 miles pretty much every winter for 7 years. And, the distances, because I took different routes every time, were like 160, 140 miles. It took 10 days. But those walks were really, gosh, they were, I took them alone, carried my own water. And they were, anyway, you got to know where the water is out there. You not only carry 3.5 gallons of water, but, you've got to find where natural water is in the natural tanks. You have to know where the water is out there or you die. These solitary walks were the greatest currency Ed Abbey and I ever shared. Ed finished one and attempted another even after he had begun to die. So with 3 friends, I buried him out there. Solitude is the deepest well I have encountered in this life. And I found most of it either down here in the desert or up in Grizzly country. Introspection arrives easily, blowing off the 2-needle pines or on the desert breeze. It's also a human luxury, best indulged in before your children are born. My long west to east walks were often taken during the holiday, and I had to give them up cold turkey once my kids were old enough to know what Christmas was. But what trips they were. Looking across the creosote Bahada, which is the flattish areas between mountain ranges, towards the nearest water in a distant mountain range, 40 impossible miles away, and then just walking there. Startling bighorn sheep, pronghorn antelope, javelina, and deer, and crossing mountain lion tracks in the uninhabited, seemingly endless expanse of arid terrain. Sitting on a memorial hill, fasting and meditating for the entire day, finding broken pottery oyas of prehistoric human and Piman pottery. And of course, there are human remains out of that, mostly graves from the 1849 gold rush, and a few miners from the turn of the 20th century. And of course, since the building of the border wall and an increase in desperate immigrants, there's many unmarked graves have been recently added. Anyway, I'm interested in this stuff, and I have can you get the cat's about to jump on the computer. The one name I have run The one name I have run across out there is John Moore. I've stumbled across it 4 times, etched on boulders, some of the most rugged and remote parts of the Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Range. I have no idea who John Moore was. He was probably a miner of some kind, because there's, you can dig for 5 years and find a quarter's worth of copper. This is very rough country. And the dates John Moore was out there with his name etched on boulders was 1906 to 1912. Twice the name of John Moore is punctuated by a startling phrase. The closest water west of where I sit is in the mountains, up 700 feet over treacherous scree and ankle-breaking basaltic boulders. Prehistoric people visited this natural tank. A boulder not far from the water is etched with a name and that enigmatic inscription. John Moore, 1909. Was it worth it? I'll read a little bit of the first story chapter because it's the one that bison are in. And it's called the Hayduke Ancestry. I just thought I owed certain people a chapter on the origins of Hayduke and all that stuff. Even today, the flash of a Hayduke Lives bumper sticker is not an uncommon sight on the byways and in the parking lots of America. For me, this signals a published acknowledgement that the writings and teachings of Ed Abbey still matter. We care about the wild ones and believe that maybe the wilderness is the only thing left worth saving. How did the fictional character of George Washington Hayduke come into imagining? Only Ed Abbey could know precisely how those particular threads came together, but the part of George that Ed borrowed from the real-life Peacock has distinct origins that were rooted in wilderness and both the trauma and value of recovering from war. The most indispensable wilderness experience in my life arrived quite accidentally in Yellowstone National Park during the decade after I returned from Vietnam. Accidental because I stumbled into the park's lodgepole pine forest at the peak of a hallucinatory malaria paroxysm. I started in the high eastern Wind River range, and I'd had enough malaria to know it was coming, and I had to get the hell out of the winds. And, Yellowstone in comparison was relatively flat and better weather. anyway, I ended up there going out of my head. I took my temperature and my last entry was 105.6 Fahrenheit temperature. So I lost my mind. So I knew what was coming, and I dreamed of grizzlies that turned out to be real bears. I really didn't know in those first few days. That experience can be replicated today because of human crowding. It occurred long enough ago that the National Park Service didn't especially think a wacko hiding out in their backcountry was worth looking for. That was a combat vet Edward Abbey met in 1968 and upon whom he later based the fictional character of George Washington Haydu. With its wildlife, wilderness, and thermal areas of refuge from deep snows, I consider Yellowstone's backcountry a paradise, and I wanted to indulge in pockets of it without interference from the outside world. This was still possible in a Yellowstone long before talk of bringing in fast food and the internet to National Park Service campgrounds. It also meant I had to hide out, like an escaped POW might have attempted in Vietnam. At that time, there was no sane boundary for me between living in the edge of the Yellowstone National Park and the fantasy of eluding capture by the Viet Cong, hunting for me in the jungles of Vietnam. I had one close call in Southeast Asia and had yet to shake the nightmare loose. I wanted to chisel the episode out of my life like a malignant lesion, but back then I couldn't. I was terrified of someone finding me camped in the woods of America. I traveled with this irrational fear buried in my backpack while tramping across the meadows and through the lodgepole pine forest. The shrinks would try to provide chunky terminology for this pathology a decade and a half later when they came up with post-traumatic stress disorder and such. On the other hand, Ed Abbey had nailed this thing in the Monkey Wrench Gang in 1975. In the meantime, I prowled around Yellowstone like a madman, leaving no tracks in the rapidly melting snow. I filled the criteria for a half a dozen paranoid categories, all of which I embraced as necessary for life in the wild. It pushed me to the edge. My contact with park rangers was infrequent and cordial. Sometimes I came out of the woods to fly fish Firehole River. My favorite band was in the Midway Geyser Basin, where hot springs sprang up near the riverbank and younger Grizzlies sometimes swam. In October of 1968, there were very few park visitors, and one ranger used to leave his patrol vehicle on top of the golden grass-covered bluff and walk down the river to ask me how the trout fishing was. And it happened to be great. His pleasant small talk constituted my entire social life. I miss that guy. But as soon as I hit the wilderness, I instinctually started sneaking around. I followed deep bison trails cut through the spring snow cornices in the afternoon, where my tracks would melt away in hours, and save snowshoe travel for cold mornings over the crusted whiteness. My camps were made deep in the timber, on the snow, or on a small patch of open ground near an isolated tree, places where no one could see them from the ground or air. I seldom kindled a fire and then only close to thermal activity where the smoke resembled vented steam. My clothing gear and tents, mostly from Army surplus, were all earth colored, and I carried a white sheet in case a plane spotted me snowshoeing in the middle of a snowy meadow, and I had to cover up. I was really quite crazy during those years. From some boyhood instinct, I considered this invisibility the correct manner in which to engage with the wild. You could conceivably cram a dozen like-minded crazies into a single valley, and we'd never know anyone else was around. Treading lightly and silently, we moved slowly so we didn't surprise and run off the wildlife. I paid close attention to all the tracks and watched the slow emergence of seasonal plants. Early spring was my favorite time because the backcountry was empty of people. Some years, 3 or 4 feet of snow lingered under the timber, and you needed snowshoes to get around. Too early for hiking and too late for skis. By midday, even snowshoes wouldn't keep me on top of the crusted snow. And I would wallow forward with a full backpack at the rate of about 100 feet an hour. You know, you could go like a quarter mile in an afternoon. Since I was interested in watching grizzly bears and I couldn't follow them except in early morning across the deeper snows of the meadows, I would often sit up on a hilltop near a thermal area. Bears exert only 1/5 of the pressure per square foot with their plantigrade gait, as do humans do on the snow. While bears walk on top, we sometimes wallow. During midday, I'd watch bison or explore the small thermal spots for animal tracks and look for hot springs cool enough to soak in. By mid-afternoon, I'd be glassing the valleys and hills for bears. On warm spring days, grizzlies tended to be crepuscular, active in the cooler hours of dawn and dusk. Soaking in hot springs or drainages is controversial because such activity in the park is mostly illegal today. True. But what a luxury those hot pools were in the snowy spring when I'd almost always choose camps in thermal zones with a soakable hot spring nearby. In the evenings, I'd carefully pad over to the thermals, alert to the occasional changing temperatures of fickle springs, and slide in, watching the celestial clock drift in the immaculate skies for 20 minutes or so. Any longer, depending on the water temperature, and you would risk passing out. Hot springs could save your life in the winter. The closest I came to an emergency was not during winter, but in April, when I broke through the ice of a small creek while wearing, cross-country snowshoes. The toes of the shoes stuck in the mud, and my 90-pound backpack body slammed me face first into the frigid water. It took me a quarter of an hour walling around in the muddy creek to extract myself. By then, I was thoroughly cold and shaky. Instead of taking the time to build a fire, I wandered over to a nearby, very hot spring. I knew, and I scout those things out constantly, so I do know the temperature. I knew a corner of this too hot pool was cool enough not to boil me like a poached trout. I stripped off my wet clothes and slowly slid in. As soon as my circulation returned, I got the hell out, retreated to the timber, and built a fire, around which I warmed and dried out my filthy wet gear. One spring morning, I made my way on snowshoes from Yellowstone Lake north to Pelican Valley. This is back, I'd have to look at my notebooks, but this is probably back about the mid-70s. Tracing well-traveled game trails, I cut through the timber following a series of finger meadows and arrived at Pelican Creek on a gooseneck overlooking the river. Across the creek lay Vermilion Springs, and beyond was a small thermal area where I could look for grizzly tracks. It's just going dark. And that's because I haven't touched it. Excuse me, I got Pamela kindly is assisting me. I'm one of the dumbest humans to stumble into the 20th and 21st, 22nd century, whatever century it is, I spent most of the morning learning about Zoom, which I didn't know much about, and going to the Apple store. I've never bought anything from the Apple store. I don't like Apple, they got too much money. So does Patagonia, but Patagonia does good things with them. And anyway, I learned today. By the way, the book is published by Patagonia. So, this is kind of like a payola announcement. I'm very fond of the company and the publishing branch of it. I crossed the shallow creek and made my way into the open ground. There was a carcass of a yearling bison on the eastern edge. The bears and coyotes were done scavenging on this one. An older track of a large grizzly lay nearby. I wondered if this was the track of the Stringent Creek grizzly, a large bear that I had spotted years before, and that was the greatest Yellowstone predator I knew. This grizzly brought down both yearling moose and smaller bison. ambushing them in the spring on the snow where they floundered. The bear circled on top of the cross and attacked them from the rear, collapsing the ungulates with his great weight, which I guess to be about 600 pounds. Retreating to the timber, I found a snow-free patch big enough to pitch a tent. I lay awake until after dark, listening to the snipe winnowing, and later hearing the repeated soft hoots of a great gray owl. Just before daybreak, the unearthly, tremulous, winnowing sound that snipe make with their outer tail feathers awakened me. I think I will hear this sound on my deathbed. If you didn't know what it was, you might think the meadows were haunted. Listen, I'm going to skip around. I'm just going to read one more passage from this. And I wondered, Leah, if you wanted to show those slides. I don't know, I don't know what's coming either. So
Okay,
I hope,
so I'll show the slides and then you could tell the stories about it and then
Yeah.
some Q&A. Or do you want to see if anybody has questions now?
if anybody's got a question as Leah's showing the slides, just pop in and, anyway, we'll see what's coming. Well, that's the cover.
Can you see that?
Yeah, I can see it. That's great. That's the cover picture taken by Doug Tompkins. We're both up on Somerset Island, in the Canadian high Arctic. And, it was an uninhabited island and, it was overlooking a fjord that was ice free. And there were like 800 beluga whales and I don't know how many narwhals, maybe 50 or 60 or so, but it was just incredible. And those beluga whales, you could look at them, you get a really good look with binoculars. Almost every beluga whale has claw marks from polar bears, scarred on its side. It was amazing how common, polar bear claw scars were on these beluga whales. So it's a tough life. There's also caribou and musk ox and, but especially the polar bears. Okay, this is not too far from where I am reading you this stuff. And it's to my west out in the Cabeza Prieta area. It's a wildlife refuge and it's surrounded by wonderful, equally beautiful wastelands, that belong to sometimes the bombing range, the very Goldwater bombing range is out there. Organ Pipe National Monument, a lot of BLM land, and it's a great wasteland, and it's bordered to the south by the Bloody Wall and Mexican Highway 2, and then the Great Pinacate Desert, which is a volcanic place with giant craters and and volcanic peaks and sand dunes and pronghorn antelope who live out there. And it's amazing to see, it's a black and white landscape with white sand dunes and black basalt. And you'll see this white antelope prancing across it. It just, I have antelope in my house. And it looks like another world out there. I'm very fond of the place. Okay. There are some grizzly tracks along a river in Yellowstone. And there's a bison herd. It's a typical. That's a cow herd. What looked like yearling bison, and pretty close to the end of the rut. I'd say probably September. And Yellowstone's still the only place where free-ranging bison that are genetically pure still roam. That's me. I had when I went in Yellowstone, I had topo sheets just because I took bushwhacks. I never used trails pretty much, but you know, I just want to get into the country. And those were good maps in the old days. They showed you, you know, forested areas and where the thermals were. And you know, but I had to use maps constantly because I was just picking areas that I thought I might catch a glimpse of a grizzly in. And it took some navigating. That's the grizzly bear and a couple cubs. Tom Mangelson took this picture, so it might be on this side of the park, on the Teton side of the park. Yeah. That's me paying my respects to a bison that died. He winter killed in a thermal area because often, you know, in hard winters, especially the bison, and this happened to be a bull herd, you know. Yeah, you see, we got a couple family members present. This is a picture from the Black Hills in 1874. That's Bloody Knife on the left. General Custer and George Bernard Grinnell as a young man on the right. And that picture is shows up a lot, and it's generally entitled Our First Grizzly. Turns out Custer shot at this bear and wounded it. He shot it in the foreleg and another minor wound. And William Ludlow, the engineer, and Bloody Knife finished it off. And Grinnell examined the carcass, and it was a male bear with a lot of scars on its head. And it was interesting to me because, as I said, one of my neighbors wrote a biography of George Bernard Grinnell, and the other man in the picture is William Ludlow, who was an engineer, and he was the model for Jim Harrison's fine novella Legends of the Fall. He was the patriarch of the family. Desert bighorn sheep down in the Cabeza Prieta range. I wrote a chapter on bighorn sheep. It's just called Counting Sheep. It's kind of tongue in cheek, but I wanted to stick some of the desert in there. Okay. That's a picture. I think that's Happy Bear. I took that picture, you know, up at the Grizzly Hilton in Glacier National Park a long time ago. Oh, Ed Abbey at his rating studio on the outskirts of west side of Tucson, having just excavated or executed his TV with that carbine. Anyway, he was fond of that picture. There's a chapter in the book that's called Monsoon about the rains in Baja, but at that time I was down there writing a book called Baja with Peter Matheson. He wrote a long introduction and I wrote the text. Terry Moore took the pictures, and we went to these incredible painted caves, and you know, this is one of them. It was there were some great trips. Peter accompanied my family, which meant I had two small children. Laurel was maybe 9 at the time. And we camped in sand dunes down in Magdalena Bay area, you know, which is just a child's paradise. It had the best beachcombing in the world, whale skeletons and shipwrecks and every kind of shell you could want to ever see. And there were whales coming through a boca or a mouth that cut through the sand dunes. Inside there were mangroves, and Peter and Laurel was old enough then she felt she needed her own tent. So they would, Laura would grab her fishing pole and go down to the estero to catch breakfast. And she'd walk by Peter, who was often up writing in his notebook, and she'd say, "Good morning, Peter," and he'd say, "Good morning, Laurel." It was beautiful. The whales were just 10 feet off those sand dunes. Okay. That's the plane that dropped us off up in the Arctic on the polar bear expedition. We originally, we chartered a plane from Yellowknife to Resolute, and then we wanted to go this beluga whale place where there's no people. And, we had to wait, I don't know, half a dozen days for the weather to clear, and then flew over the ice pack to Somerset Island. That's a picture by, I don't know, it says Doug Tompkins, but I thought Rick Ridgway might have taken it. Anyway, you can see it was kind of cold up there. When the wind shifted and it blew off the ice pack, man, it dropped like 30, 40 degrees in minutes. And that's where the polar bears were mostly. I mean, we saw some on land, but they eventually wanted to go to the ice pack, where, of course, all their seal hunting took place. And now with the climate change and, the loss of Arctic sea ice, it's really severe. The polar bears are starving and they're going inland and south as the grizzly bears themselves are coming north, and they're interbreeding. In fact, polar bears and grizzlies are genetically very close. Polar bear is a recent evolution. Maybe 200,000 or 300,000 years ago, a Siberian brown bear wandered north onto the ice and started hunting seals. The end product of that evolution happens to be the polar bear that looks different and it acts different and all kinds of stuff. But genetically, they're so close that a couple times in the past, the polar bear has disappeared and folded its genes back in the grizzly bear, only to reemerge again a second time. And, polar bears and grizzly bears are they're, they mate with one another and, their offspring are reproductive. So they're very close. And you've got a bunch of grizzly bears that have been given, cute names, but it's actually a rather desperate, evolution, because the polar bear is, without the reversal of Arctic climate change and global warming, they're not going to be around very long. Okay, let's see what we got here. That's that's a Siberian tiger expedition. That's Yvonne Chenard, a lot of Jackson people there. Doug Tompkins, Jeb Ellison, Tom Brokaw, and me. That was our crew with a Russian biologist named Dmitry Pekhanov, and he was a great man. We didn't speak hardly any Russian, and he didn't speak much English, but it was a great trip. Okay. This is a shot of a Siberian tiger hightailing it. I think it came from some kind of trail cam. Okay. There's a chapter down there of trying to live up to it. Could you put him on a leash and just walk him outside, but don't let him bark outside too much. Okay, right, all right, I got that. Yeah, just, sorry, folks, we have got dogs for roommates this time of year. Anyway, I went down to Belize on a total phony Islands magazine trip, where I told him I was gonna, play Robinson Crusoe, when in fact I smuggled my girlfriend with me. So anyway, I fished poorly and everybody lost a lot of weight. Okay. Well, that's just that's the beach, and it's an uninhabited cay, and I picked it mainly mangrove swamps with just a couple pods of palm trees, so you can pitch your tent and you don't have to sleep with the no-see-ums and mosquitoes. But I picked it because I knew there wouldn't be any people there, and there had been, however, old conch camps in fishing camps. So there's a lot of good junk, you know, laying around like Robin Crusoe, and I can make my own spears and things like that. Okay. There's Andrea down on an unnamed K off of, let's see, what's the closest? Dingaria is not very far, you know, inland from there. It's, 50 miles or so. And there's lots of uninhabited islands around. We had kayaks, we had folding kayaks. I borrowed Tom Brokaw's twice. He was kind enough to buy 2 Feathercraft portables, and then I used one in the Russian Far East. We went down the Beacon River, and I borrowed another one for this island trip. You know, that's how we got around. I fished out them, and so I left Tom when I picked up the car. I left him a note, you know, and I was afraid I wouldn't come back, and I said, you know, in the chance the kayak doesn't get returned, I hereby sign over to you my 94 GMC pickup, you know, and then I wrote him another postcard because I didn't think I was clear enough. I said, the keys are, you know, under the dashboard. So anyway, I didn't lose the kayak, and I still have the truck. Okay. Oh, this is down in the Galapagos. My daughter Laurel took this picture. I went down, Rick Bass and Terry Timbus Williams, very good friends of mine, bullied me into coming down, you know, because it's my idea of, you know, going on a trip on a boat with strangers. Well, the instructions are when you're in the Galapagos, you're not supposed to touch anything, really, you know. That wasn't quite my idea of a wilderness trip. But for these guys, I'd do anything. So we had a great trip. And there's a chapter on the Galapagos in this book. That's that. Towards the end of my tour, on a camp within a thermal area, you can see it's spring, but the reason there's no snow right here is because it's warm ground and, you know, the ground has melted out. I'm very fond of bison, and back in this particular place, bison die commonly, and you know, they send park rangers in there with sledgehammers to smash the skulls apart. And I asked, you know, the chief ranger that. I said, you know, why do you do that? He said, so the people don't get them. But for my part, I would collect these skulls, and I made, within a couple miles of where I am here now, I made a circle of bison skulls facing east, you know, that I decorate every year with seashells from the Sea of Cortez or pottery from Chaco or something like that. You know, there's grizzly skulls, bison skulls, and it's a holy site. When my own culture doesn't provide ceremonies, I tend to just make up my own. Okay.
That's the end of the
Okay.
slideshow.
Yeah, listen, let me read you a short piece. Actually, I got to see what time it. What time is it?
So we have 5 minutes to 7. Do we want to start the Q&A?
I'll tell you what. We're not going to show the film, right?
No, and I could drop the film.
You can let everybody watch it on their own, okay?
Right. I'll put the film in the chat.
Okay, I'm going to read part of the last chapter, which is a postscript. And the title of this note, this final note, is The Perfect Bait for an Outbreak. And this is really what the book's about. You know, the publisher once called it a memoir of climate change, and it was pretty close, I thought. 50 years ago, when I began my advocacy for grizzlies, Yellowstone's bears were in worse shape than glaciers, and I focused more on the isolated population around Yellowstone Park. And my work consisted of advertising the plight of our surviving grizzly bears through lectures and radio and TV things. I would bargain my way on national news programs because I had a growing archive of wild grizzly footage, and they wanted to show it, and they'd have to let me champion grizzly bears at the same time. Though humans killing grizzlies is always a major concern, my main message was that big wilderness areas and connecting them was what was most needed for survival. Survival of viable grizzly population, nearly every other animal species I could think of depended on wild habitats. Almost every creature evolved in habitats where adverse human influence was weak or absent, another way of defining wilderness. Of course, that's changed today. And Yellowstone was where my awareness hardened towards dogma. Most species of wild animal are eligible for an endangered species listing today because their habitats are disappearing. Unofficially, but unmistakably, that list would include Homo sapiens. We saw it coming close to home throughout the Yellowstone ecosystem. And here I bring up the example of whitebark pine, which started to disappear with warming temperatures in 2002. And in 5 to 7 years, my biologist friend Jesse Logan estimated that over 90% of the mature whitebark pine trees had died in just that brief period. And that was the first. It was so dramatic because you drive around the Yellowstone ecosystem and look at the tops of the mountains and they're all red. It don't take a weatherman. Anyway, you guys know about whitebark pine. Anyway, Yellowstone's being hammered by wildfire, and everywhere around, out of control California type wildfires. Wildfires are expected in the Rockies any day now, maybe this summer. Looming over all of us is the rising temperature of the planet. Feeding this global fever has been relentless emissions of greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide. Methane, a more powerful greenhouse, at least in the short run, is rapidly boiling out of the thawing permafrost of the Arctic, Siberia, Alaska, and the continental shelf of the ice-free Arctic Sea. It happens very fast. And the warming response, which we haven't paid any attention to, it can be expected to be abrupt. And there are climate change feedback systems. The big ones are on the poles. In the Arctic, where the temperature rise is more rapid than any place on Earth, the loss of sea ice has been extreme and extensive. By September, the sea is clear of ice far past the extension of the continental shelf, and thus sunlight is absorbed rather than reflected. In the Antarctica, those huge ice sheets are breaking up, especially in the West Antarctica. And further east, the Ross ice sheet, which is the largest ice shelf down there, floats above the sea and is melting and breaking up. And it's happened before. If the Ross were to go, that'd be like they say 5 meters or about 16 feet of sea rise in a week. And the potential of a dozen feet of sea rise at any time should terrify coastal city dwellers or people living in low-lying areas like Bangladesh or Florida. From the interface of humans and animals in deforested, overhunted habitats, now degraded by climate change, creep an endless emergence of deadly zoonotic diseases, and we know about this one. It jumps from animals like bats, chimps, and birds, and COVID-19 is one of these. The current coronavirus, though not to diminish its singular and deadly horror, is a good example. The emergence of this particular pandemic is thought to involve bats, bushmeat, and wet markets. We can see this one coming. Perfect storm of 7.8 billion people on Earth, the fragmentation and destruction of habitats, that draws humans and animals in increasing contact. We witnessed those thunderheads taking charge. Doug Tompkins warned us long ago that climate change would subsume all other human issues, social or otherwise. David Quammen also said that in his fine book, Spillover. If we could see the spillover coming, why couldn't this chain of infection be interrupted? And, the chain of infection, our bush meat, traveling and taking hikes on hitching rides on endangered animals like pangolins or bats, and ending up in wet markets. And of course, I know I was chairman of the board of Run River Conservation Studies for 25 years. And we had student programs in Botswana and Namibia, for decades. And, our best estimates are 3/4 of the game counts are down. And, and because of illegal hunting and the top-down approach of much touted armed rangers and aircraft to bust poachers has failed. With national governments depending on tourism to bring in the big bucks, village communities are mostly left out, poor and hungry. And that's why, the poachers don't get turned in. The poached game is trafficked with legal meat coming from game farm. Bushmeat feeds workers at Chinese-owned gold mines and diamond mines in Africa, or it's moved out to wet markets, characterized by the sale of live or dead animals of almost any species. And wet markets are not confined to Asia. New York has 80 of them. I really wonder if we can get rid of them. I think wet markets are vulnerable. With massive worldwide pressure, we could get rid of them. The pictures of dogs and cats hanging with civets and chimps, dripping bodily fluids in a filthy stall gets public attention. But cruelty does not stop at the domestic fence line. Human greed has driven such brutality into the last wild nooks of the planet. The current pandemic will not be our last plague, and it is a prime symptom that our center is not holding. Our smug assumptions of the primacy of our civilization are coming apart. Humans are not in control of the world we live in. We are not in charge. Wildfires everywhere, burning trees and releasing record carbon emissions. The boreal forests across Siberia and Alaska, the criminal fires in the Amazon, the fires at Denial in Australia, and our own unstoppable fires that I expect to hit the northern Rocky Mountains. I expected them last year, so anytime. Related to rising temperatures in grain-producing regions of the world, mainly North America and Asia. These crops could fail any season now, resulting in worldwide famine. Starving people would want to get the hell out, go someplace north where they could grow food. Since humans occupy virtually every fertile chunk of ground on Earth, conflict is unavoidable. Wars will break out. Along with pestilence, this sounds like a warning from the New Testament. Cattle are a worldwide curse. Besides the methane they produce, cows are an excuse for burning the Amazon, the loss of which many think will be the tipping point for the global carbon exchange keeping the planet alive. We have not told ourselves the truth. Because it was everyone's job, it was no one's job. There's so much beauty in the world. All we have to do is stick around to see it. For a father who loves the earth and finds joy in defending wild landscape, considering our demise as a species is not a pleasant exercise. But we need to see the truth, the raw, unvarnished truth. Science and journalism water down the severity of a changing climate and pull their punches. When we try to extract the most credible science from each, we find much of it filtered through caution and timidity. There are semantic arguments that optimism and hope will color a rosier world, but how we feel about it does not change that unpolished truth. That which evolves does not persist without the conditions of its genesis, is a sentence I've found myself repeating monotonously throughout the decades. When I first wrote that line in a Glacier National Park fire lookout, I was thinking about habitat, especially grizzly bear and human tat, which I considered the same, the mingled fate of humans and bears. For the first 300,000 years of our time on Earth, human intelligence was carved in habitats whose remnants today we would call wilderness. Only in the past 15,000 years have we modified that wilderness, first with the extinction of the great late Pleistocene megafauna, and then with the rise of agriculture from multiple origins around the globe in the last 10,000 years. For over 95% of our time on Earth, human evolution, organic intellectual evolution, was honed in that pre-agricultural landscape, owing little or nothing to our time on farms or in cities. That relationship is something I don't want to gamble on. The fight to preserve wilderness is still primary. Okay, I'll read the last paragraph. Oh, anyway, when it is indeed our time to walk off stage with the mammoths, what might be the measure of our character at the end of our tour? After peering into the abyss, how do we behave? There is great joy in doing the toll of the world, fighting for wild causes, saving pieces of the magnificent natural world. Who and what is at risk? If past extinctions provide guidelines, then it's all life larger than a small meadow mouse. Now I can unpleasantly anticipate being among those minority humans left on Earth that die from old age. I'd be happier if everyone could. It's a scourge in my geezerhood. I am unconcerned with my own death and fatally engaged in the lives of all my survivors. There is a bottomless, contradictory sadness and a fleeting glimpse of justice. Nature bats last. Avenging the scorched earth, payback to Homo sapiens, bundled up in the loss of beauty and the suffering in the lives of the people you love most. But then I watched a glacier grizzly walking slowly through a herd of elk that paid him no mind nor got out of his way. And I end this long paragraph was I watched 8 grizzly bears with Doug Seuss at the Grizzly Hilton. And there were 4 mothers that were sitting around a small pond and kind of swaying with 4 cubs of the year and 1 yearling and a pair of subadults who were a previous litter of one of the grizzlies. And they were swaying back and forth. And it's the only time I've seen that many grizzlies in the lower 48, in close proximity to one another. Science doesn't admit this spectrum of behavior. The bears were dancing. It was worth it. Oh gosh, shut up.
Thank you. All right, we're a little over time, so I want to respect everybody's time. So if you have to log off, that's fine, but let's open it up to some questions. There's a question in the chat that I'll start off while everybody's thinking of their question. And it comes from Ryan Sim. Hey, Doug, when I was a much younger man, I saw you give a reading in Utah. Afterwards, we got talking about hunting. I asked if you would ever hunt a bear. You bowed your head and muttered no, as if your heart was broken. It was a stupid question. I'm sorry that I asked it. You've talked a bit tonight about poaching. I'm wondering where you stand, not on legalized hunting, or where do you stand on legalized hunting?
I'm against it, and there's a whole chapter in this book why I don't trophy hunt. Edward Abbey gave me a National Rifle Association sticker long time ago because we back then we didn't we had firearms, we hunted a little tiny bit, and owned a bunch of firearms. But since then, National Rifle Association and especially Safari International has been the great enemy of wild animals, especially predators. They want to kill for trophies and get bounties for every wolf and grizzly that they can kill. And the states of Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana are the worst. The new legislators have pieced together, the most obscene kill a grizzly, kill a wolf legislation. It doesn't have to, it's not binding because the states are not in charge of the Endangered Species Act list, and grizzlies are on it. It's a the federal wildlife, Fish and Wildlife Service that holds that card. I had a Zoom call with them yesterday because I'm really concerned. They've got to flip back on Trump, and that's the only thing that's going to keep trophy hunting and endless killing of wolves in those 3 states from occurring. The Federal Wildlife Service has got to stand up to them and stand up for the Endangered Species Act. I would love to see the wolves stuck back on it because of the incredible amount of killing that you can do from helicopters with bait, with dogs. How many did they kill in Wisconsin? Like 3,000 in record time. And they'll do the same thing in Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho if they get the chance. So I'm against trophy hunting. I'm not against hunting. I still cook a few game birds.
Does anyone on the chat want to ask, or anyone on the call want to ask a question directly to Doug? You could either raise your hand, unmute yourself.
Yeah, I wouldn't shoot a bear for a cool many million.
Okay, here's a question in the chat. Thank you, Doug. The few grizzlies in the Yak Valley are dwindling. What would you suggest to help protect them and raise awareness?
Those bears are down to a dangerous number. The main things is the connectivity doesn't exist there really. They're down to low 20s of number of grizzlies left. It's not a viable population the way it's going. The poaching is really something. And if the feds don't prosecute poachers, I don't think there's any deterrence for shooting a grizzly over in the Yak. I mean, there was an atrocious killing of a mother grizzly and a couple of her cubs, where the bear was just pumped full of bullets. It was a hate killing, like a hate crime. And you guys live in the Jackson Hole area, and I live on the other side of the ecosystem. It's Yellowstone that we've really got to concentrate on. We've got to get it hooked up with glacier. And that means underpasses, overpasses on I-90. I've been working with Lance Craighead for a couple of years on an existing underpass of I-90. So that's what. And, the grizzlies have just got to stay on the Endangered Species Act. And, the feds can't stand back from the states right now. It's just a really precarious position. But, I would concentrate on, the Glacier Park ecosystem is, it's okay because it's got connectivity to Canada and the Barb Marsh and a big area of connected land. Yellowstone does not. And if you really wanted, to save the Yak grizzlies, you'd connect them up with Yellowstone.
I see Zoom user, you have your hand up. If you can unmute yourself, you can ask your question. Yep.
I was wondering if Doug hunted much with Jim Harrison.
Yes. I did most of more hunting with Jim Harrison than anybody else. And down here, we'd go after, Mearns quail, harlequin quail, and once or twice doves. And then we'd hunt mainly Hungarian partridge up in Montana. But he was a lot of fun. And of course, we had great barbecues afterwards.
I heard so. That's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
Okay, there's another question in the chat. Here in Idaho, our legislature has declared a slaughter on all wolves in our state. It's back to the days of aerial hunting and trapping and bounties from 1,500 down to 150. How do we stop this slaughter?
We probably can only stop that by relisting the wolf and putting it on the Endangered Species Act. It's got to be put in. I mean, my own center didn't help much with that one, but you know, you're not going to save them from states like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana if you can't put a value on that. And you know, the state legislatures will never get it, you know, ever. And and it's, you know, you read these bills and it's hate, you know, people, you know, tend to hate what they don't know, and increasingly what we don't know includes so much of the natural world, you know, especially the predators. And you know, we fear what we don't know, and you know, that's it's really scary. But the best hope for the wolf is that Deb Holland will find the reserves to go ahead and slap it back under some coverage under the Endangered Species Act. You know, wolves, the argument is they reproduce really well, which is true, but why do you need to, you know, why do you need to knock off 85% of the existing population just to see them die? I can't get behind that ever. Yeah, okay. And you know, Idaho is in the same bag as Wyoming and Montana too. Okay.
Anyone else with a question that's on the call? Maggie Anderson, you can unmute
I'll ask.
yourself. And then Phil Round afterwards. Or Phil, you're unmuted. Go for it. And then Maggie.
Well, hey, Doug.
Hey, I know this dude, you know.
It's out of our ecosystem, but do you know the work of Damian Mander and the Akashinga and what they're doing with the International Anti-Poaching Foundation and African
Yeah, I've
game
read
parks?
about it, Phil.
Yeah. It's not our ecosystem, but it's an amazing program that Damian put together.
Mm-hmm.
You talking
Well, it's
about
enlightened. Do you
really,
think
yeah.
it's effective, Phil? Your opinion?
Well, what do I know? But Damien's an amazing guy, and he's just, well, he's an inspiration like you. I'm not trying to kiss any ass, but he's like you. You know, he's a character, and he has done this thing that has really made a difference, and made a difference in African women's lives. It's not just about wildlife saving, but empowering women in Africa, which is an amazing sociological thing. So anyway, just mentioning it.
Yeah. You know, when the Grizzlies got delisted in 2016, I had to resign from Round River and take care of grizzly bears because, you know, 2016 is when they decided to delist them and also claim that climate change is having no effect whatsoever in grizzlies, nor is it anticipated to have any effect in the future. That's 2016 with the rule by the Federal Wildlife Service. I suspect that's still, you know, in the bowels of the organization. You know, you don't just get enlightenment with a new administration. We all know that. Hi, Maggie.
Hey, Doug. I don't have any questions because you answered all of them, but I just wanted to say thanks. It's so good to see you, and congrats on your book.
Well, thank you. Yeah, today is the release, you know.
I know.
It's
It's
been
good.
a long road.
Yeah, well, we're all glad to have it. See ya.
See ya.
Bye, Maggie. All right, we have time for one more
Bye.
question. Does anyone want to ask the last question? I can see everyone. Okay, there's one from Kirk Astroth. We know the wall is bad for wildlife, but what about for people? We know that Abby was no friend of the Mexican migrants. Where do you stand?
You know, I really, I think that wall is no service to anyone, human or animal. I think it's just, it's an evil gesture, you know, where I am right now, it's covered, you know, 300 miles in the most pristine desert anywhere, including all of Oregon Pipe National Monument. And it's an absolute barrier to all movement, you know, human or animals, anything that can't fly over it or crawl under it is going to be stopped. And I think we need an interim plan for the wall. Eventually that goddamn wall needs to be, you know, torn down and recycled. But short of that, we've got to re-identify, just like Lance and I are doing on I-90, corridors, underpasses, whatever, and punch holes in this fence where the pronghorn antelope down in the Pinacotes of Mexico need to get up to the Capes of Prieto, you know, with the monsoons and you know, we're in a drought everywhere. They've got to move. The jaguars, I'm going to go over the Chiricahuas in a month or two, and that's where ocelots and jaguars are crossing. We got to reopen those things right away and just treat it like you know, like an absolute barrier, like we treat freeways. And, you know, we're not making much progress on freeways either. But that thing, you know, I'm all for, you know, I welcome everybody, two-legged or otherwise, and I'll fight for that, you know. And we've got to reform all kinds of immigration laws, and I'm just hoping it'll happen in my lifetime. Meanwhile, I want a hole for a jaguar.
Thank you. All right. I know that there's someone named Chris who wants to give you a special message before we log off.
Hey, Doug. I just wanted to say that you had a huge influence in my life. I actually left my wife and 2-year-old child to try and find myself after serving in Iraq. I was actually a park ranger in Yellowstone, and I stumbled across your book in the book peddler called Walking It Off. And that was my introduction to Doug Peacock, and my world has blossomed since then. So I just wanted to thank you for writing that and expressing it in a way that really made me feel like I wasn't alone, you know. And
yeah, that's exactly why I wrote that book, is for people like you. You know, I just wanted to share that, you know, you really get separated from your own kind, and sometime knock on the door and come back in a little bit. And it didn't happen to me all at once, but, you know, I put the stuff in the book that I hope would be useful to vets of all our, you know, there hasn't been a decent war. We only came in second, you know, and
yeah, you definitely
never mind.
help me embrace wilderness and use that as a source of healing that I've kind of shared with others too. So thank you for that. I'm looking forward to this new book.
Okay, parts of the Park Service won't like it, but it was, you know, as Edward Abbey said, when wilderness is outlawed, only outlaws can say wilderness. So, thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Doug. And let's everybody give a shout out to Doug, or put, you can do the reactions and do a clappy hand. And we did record this. So if you ever wanted to go back and watch a part of it, you can look back on our Mountain Story website or our library YouTube page, and it'll be there. Otherwise, our next Mountain Story event is online, and it's a evening of stories with Rick Ridgway, who Doug did mention took one of his photos in his slideshow. So it's a nice kind of family event here. So that's going to be on Thursday, February 10th, on the same Zoom link. So thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Liz.
Doug.
Okay.
Thanks, Doug.
Thank you.